Next up, we have the very esteemed Lars Kamp from Accenture. He threw a gorgeous party the other night. Thanks, Lars. I'm sure a lot of you were there. He's a really important guy in the Valley. He leads mobility and strategy for Accenture on the mobile side, and is also an investor. He's investing in Mushape, Mixo, and Breezy. And it's just a man about town in San Francisco, and we really wanted to hear from him. He's crunched a lot of numbers, and here's a lot of great stuff, and he is the only person allowed to have slides at this thing, and we're going to go mega fast, and he's going to put it up on SlideShare for everybody to take a look, but some really good findings, and hopefully it'll bear out what we've been hearing on the panels as we go. Thanks, Lars. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenneth. So yeah, is this working? All right. So good morning, everybody. My name is Lars Kamp. I head up strategy and corporate development for Accenture Mobility. I'd like to thank Matthias, Rebecca, and Candice for putting on this event. I think Barcelona needs an event like this, and I'm pretty sure you guys will outgrow this venue for next year. So having said that, why am I here? So Accenture is big in enterprise mobility. We're the biggest provider of enterprise mobility on the planet here. In my own personal private life, I do a little bit of angel investments in San Francisco in the mobile space, so I think that qualifies me why I stand here up on stage. So this deck, we'll go through a few data points here today. We're talking about orders of magnitude trends that will help you to figure out what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And we're going to talk about 6 different topics here. Candice mentioned it. We'll put it up on SlideShare. There's a lot of data in here, and I'll breeze through it. So let's talk about platform proliferation, more and more mobile devices. So if you look at the digital world in 2012, you compare it to 2007, what you see is massive growth coming from the bottom, mobile internet users. This is what's driving the industry. There's more and more smartphones in every pocket. Very soon, we're going to overtake the number of internet users out there. And obviously, there's massive room for growth. You can see there's about 6 billion mobile subscribers out there. So the difference between those two is basically the number of feature phones. And Eric mentioned it yesterday, they're going to be replaced. He thinks they're going to be replaced in the next year. If you believe IDC, it's going to be over the next 5 years. Who owns that market? Well, today, smartphones, it's a two-horse race. There's a potential of a third. But today, Android and iPhone own 80% of the installed base. They own this market, right? We think there is space for a third ecosystem. We have high hopes for Windows Phone. A couple of reasons. The operators want a third one. Another one is localization. There are countries like Indonesia, Cambodia, massive user base, and they want localized phones. And Microsoft is looking back on a 20-year investment in localizing software for those markets. So we think there's room for a third, but right now this is a two-horse race. Let's talk a little bit about Android. Android is iterating right now twice a year. They're churning out a new version of their OS pretty much every 6 months. So you get a new dessert every 6 months. You're following the letter, right? They actually started with Astro and Bender, but then they realized, we can't trademark those brands, so we'll just go with the dessert. So, Jelly Bean is next. We don't know yet what the hero device is, but the way they're doing that, getting Android entrenched in the ecosystem is, well, with every Android release, they go to market with an OEM, and they go to market with one semi-co vendor, right? And building a phone is something really, really complex, and the reason for that is, well, it's simply hard. Putting a radio on a chip is hard. And so they focus on it with one vendor at a time. And what that happens, it creates this effect of, they have the greatest hero device. I want to have that too. So slowly, over the course of 3 years, Android got entrenched in the ecosystem from the bottom up with every silicon piece that's out there right now. And compare that to the other platforms. For instance, Windows Phone, they're running just on Qualcomm these days. And so Eric mentioned it yesterday, there's going to be an Android phone in every pocket. Well, it looks like they're on track. If you look at what they're shipping and activating every day, they started with about 300,000. I think the formatting gets screwed up here, but okay. They started with 300,000 shipments or activations a day in January last year, and we're at 2011. In December 2011, we're seeing shipments of 700,000 Android devices every day, 700,000. Multiply that times 356, that's a big number. And I'd like to give Jeff Haney from Accelerator credit for the slide. I think this really expressed it well. This is what mobility looks like today, platform proliferation. So mobility was really easy with the iPhone 1. Android came to market, and then you saw that all these, we talked about how Android is getting entrenched, and you see all these different OEMs launching more and more devices. So this is something that we see happening in the enterprise. You've heard this is bring your own device, right? So it's a big headache for CIOs. How do I serve all these different device platforms, right? No Android device is like the other one. Different chipset, different Android market, different screen size. So big problem, but what we see is there is going to be a mobile phone in everybody's pocket, a smartphone in everybody's pocket. let's talk a little bit about the cloud and the abundance of computing power in the cloud. So you have these two pillars, cloud and mobile. And I'll go back in history a little bit. So back in 1851, there was a gentleman called Mr. Burton, and he had something, he had an iron plant, and he made horseshoes. And so he thought, like, why can't I make more horseshoes? I need more power. So he created this, what's called the Burton's wheel, Burton's water wheel. So it's a massive wheel. It was about 22 meters high. And maybe you can see the people who are standing next to it. That gives you an impression of the scale. So he had this plant right next to it, and he was churning out 250 horseshoes a minute, which was huge. Massive deal back then, right? But you can also see the plant isn't there anymore, right? So this picture is taken in 1890. And so what happened? So you fast forward, and both of these plants are in the state of New York. So Adams plant in upstate New York in Buffalo. So Tesla had invented the electric generator along with Westinghouse. Westinghouse commercialized it. And what you see on the right there, these are Westinghouse generators. And each one of them has about the power of one Burton's wheel, right? And you see 10 on this picture. And so basically you're getting to 37 megawatt, which is 2 orders of magnitude more than what Burton had. And so Burton also had a wheel that only did one thing. It provided energy to Burton's plant. That was it. It was monolithic. This one here, you put a transmission line on it, and it brings electricity to the entire state of New York at much cheaper prices. And so you fast forward again, and Eric talked about that yesterday as well, electricity is pervasive today. And today, we see utilities lighting up Times Square 24/7. In fact, electricity is so cheap that it's pervasive. And in some areas, darkness is a scarce good now because we're lighting up our cities everywhere 24/7. Now you're going to ask, well, what does that mean for us today? Well, if we look at the enterprise and if we look at computing, there's a concept called the computing utility, the computer utility. It was a concept that was defined in 1996 by a gentleman called Douglas Parkhill. And so he talked about the three functions: processing, storage, and collection and distribution of information. So that was a theoretical concept, but he wasn't able to put it into practice simply because the computing power wasn't there. But you fast forward, and enterprises have data centers. They have tens of CPUs there. It's a very heterogeneous environment, and I do like those curved racks. Those are pretty cool. But this is what they have at hand. But you compare that now, think back to Burton's wheel and the data center here, so you have tens of CPUs, and you compare that to a Facebook data center, which has about 100,000s of CPUs, right? Depending on how fast they build it out. So 2 to 3 orders of magnitude more processing power here in the cloud at a highly industrialized scale. So this looks a little bit like Adam's plant. So you sort of fast forward and you think, what's going to happen with computing, right? You have all this stuff in the cloud. We're getting LTE, more powerful smartphones. So all this computing stuff will end up in your pocket through powerful devices. And who's driving that? Well, it's the big six. All of these guys are making big, multi-billion-dollar investments into the cloud across the planet. So massive off-deck computing power. And just to give you an impression of how Google does it, so Google invests in the billion every year into their data center infrastructure. And when you see the fluctuation here, it's because they build it out, they build out the server infrastructure, they wait for demand to catch up. Once demand is at about 70 to 80%, they start building out a new one. So billion-dollar investments into off-deck cloud infrastructure. How is that stuff being used? Well, we looked at Amazon. So what we did here, we took Amazon pricing over time. We plotted it on a curve. So you can see on Amazon S3, which is their storage product, you pay on a per gigabyte per month basis. And back in 2007, you paid 15 cents. That pricing has gone down to 9 cents. What happens when the price of a good goes down? Demand goes up. And you can see that as a proxy, the number of objects being stored in Amazon's cloud, up from 14 billion to 1 trillion 200 billion. So there's massive demand for cloud. And then the question is, well, what are all those objects, right? Well, that gets us to the app avalanche, the App Store, the appification of everything. So app stores is the latest craze, has been for the last 4 years, and there's about 725 apps, 725,000 apps in Apple's App Store, a little bit less in Android, which tells the story since they're shipping more, right? So there's a lot of fragmentation involved, also in terms of monetization, number of countries where you can sell apps. But if you look at these curves, they very much start to look like an exponential curve. So very soon we're going to see the million mark crossed. Everybody has an app. And so what do we see here? We see the appification of things, right? So people, things, machines, real estate, and even time gets replaced by a piece of software. People, cabulous. If you've tried it here in Barcelona, you can call a cab from your mobile phone. It's great. I don't speak Spanish. I just understand it. So click, and it really works, right? You no need for a dispatcher anymore. That's a job that's gone, period. Uber Cab is doing the same. things. You put a key on your smartphone, you don't need a key in your pocket anymore. Chase, you scan your check, no need for an ATM anymore. In America, we use a lot of checks. This is my favorite, Cherry. So the major cost of doing a car wash is water and real estate. You need a corner real estate piece. Very expensive. And what these guys do, you can call them from your smartphone, GPS correlated. They drive up to your house, they wash your car. They invented a special chemical product that doesn't need water, and you get a car wash for $29 while you work, while you're in the office. You don't need to drive there, and as such, you're basically replacing time as well. Fantastic business models. And these four, actually 5 generic concepts, are very important to understand going forward what software on a device can do. Couple of things, we put mobile and cloud together. We see something called consumerization, right? Transport, relay rides, peer-to-peer car lending, office IT, breezy, consumerization of office IT. You can print from any printer around you. Finance, Holger talked about it, the Square wallet. Finally, real estate, you don't need an office space, you just book a place when you need one. What happens to a company that's exposed to the mobile app ecosystem? Well, let's look at eBay here. What we did is, I hope you can see the numbers here. So eBay has 2 main lines of business. It's eBay and PayPal, right? And they measure the business with 2 KPIs. It's gross merchandise value for eBay and net total payment volume for PayPal. It's basically the amount and the volume that's being transacted on those 2 platforms. So Joe Donoghue mentions on the earnings call sometimes what share of that is being processed through mobile. And so we plotted that, and lo and behold, you know, it's about 13% for eBay, and it's about 5% for PayPal. And what is breathtaking is the growth at which it, you know, the growth rate, 233%, 517% for PayPal. So eBay is becoming a mobile company, right? And it's growing at an exponential rate. It's mind-blowing. And if you look at the desktop business, which is eBay's core business, it's growing at inflation. It's basically stalling. So growth is in mobile for eBay. Commodity computing. So what we see, let's shift on here. What do people do with this cloud stuff, right? So we call that commodity computing, and what we see is a shift in enterprise IT consumption to anything as a service. So what we did is we took the UAT asset prices from the BEA, we plotted it on a logarithmic chart so we can see orders of magnitude, and we see that transportation equipment, any type of hardware equipment, is basically growing at inflation. We did the same for computers and equipment, and you see that it's going down by orders of magnitude pretty much every decade, or faster. What happens when the price of a good goes down? Consumption goes up. So what we see here is basically enterprise IT consumption is going up. They're spending about $3,500 per enterprise employee on an annual basis, which translates into a $350 billion industry. And it keeps growing and growing and growing and growing as things get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You know, remember what Amazon does? You see that happening at a macro scale here. So the question is, when companies invest, what do they invest in? Well, there are 2 generic things, hardware and software, right? So we plotted that as well, the ratio, and you can see there's a nice 1-to-1 ratio all the way to 1995. And all of a sudden, it breaks out. Well, what happens? So basically, this means ratio 1-to-1. For every dollar of hardware spent, you see $1 of software spent, right? And you see it fluctuating. Why is that? Well, this is the Wintel business model, right? You update your server infrastructure, you buy stuff from Intel, you buy new boxes, and that's your hardware investment. You have that installed for 3 to 4 years. You do your software investment, right? So that's when software goes up and hardware goes down. You go through the cycle. But something happened in 1995. The web. So what we see happening is anything as a service all of a sudden, because companies don't spend money on hardware anymore, or at least not as much as they used to, and there's outspending in software. What's happening here? Well, the web, right? 1990, ARPANET got decommissioned. Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. In 1995, we saw the first true Web 1.0 companies, Yahoo, Amazon, Netscape. Netscape's product was actually a web server. You know, we all relate to them as a browser company, but their actual product was a web server that you would buy as an enterprise. So they actually sold that hardware, but we see the impact of that is that companies consume more and more software. So there's a clear trend that everything is moving into the cloud here. And we believe that trend will continue as the iPhone launches, or any smartphone. You see 2007, the iPhone launch, it's going up. Obviously, that dip is the US recession. You just got to let Wall Street do it, and they'll send it down the drain. What does that mean for us in architecting your IT, if you're an enterprise, even if you're a startup? What does that mean? So let's talk about it. So 3 things we see: open source, open standards, APIs. We strongly believe in these 3 things. And we took a couple of quotes here from S1 filings, Facebook. Everybody knows Steve Jobs' quote. I'm sure Adobe does best. And then obviously APIs, Jeff Bezos, he threatened to fire anybody who wouldn't build APIs. So these three things, let me briefly talk about that. So we talked about how Android iterates on their code, or Google iterates the Android code base. And you can see how they started out. They open sourced it in 2008, and so that's the jump in the code base here. And it goes up to 3.6 million lines of code. I'm sorry, code base, right? And you see with every major release, the code base goes up, and they're starting to stabilizing now the code base, right? Bug fixing, reducing fragmentation. But anyhow, this is open source. Anybody can download this. It's not a complete handset, but it's an operating system. You can put it on a device, right? The device runs, it's intelligent. Figure out how it connects with the network, Wi-Fi, you know, but this is open source, you download it, there's no software licensing model involved anymore. And we see many other projects like that. WebKit is powering all the major browsers, right? Just go on GitHub, thousands of open source projects. And then what I did is I went on Indeed.com, which is the largest job aggregator in the United States, right? So it's a little bit of a sentiment of what companies, what skills, what type of skills companies are hiring. And lo and behold, the fastest growing keyword across all industries, not just tech, all industries, is HTML5, right? HTML5. So basically the technology that gives you a native experience in a browser, which makes sense because everything is moving into the cloud, but you do want to have a native experience, right? And so it's the fastest growing keyword on Indeed.com. And you look at the other ones too, MongoDB, that's a big data problem, right? It's a database, a NoSQL database. But you look at everything else, and it's all big data on mobile. Everything is big data on mobile. And so companies are hiring these skills, apparently, right? And we talked about APIs. So we went on Programmable Web. We just plotted the number of APIs that are getting published every month. And you see two trends here, right? Obviously, the number of APIs published every month is growing. And you accumulate it, and it goes up. So we have 500,000 plus publicly documented APIs on there. And Facebook is on there, Google is on there, American Airlines, Best Buy, all these companies are launching APIs. They're exposing their assets, making them available, making data available, making data consumable. So you put that stuff all together, you plot it all on Indeed, and you see this chart here. So remember, HTML5 is the fastest growing keyword in online job search in the United States. And you see all of a sudden, you know, APIs have been around for a bit, but it's a growing trend. 2009, HTML5 kicks in after iOS has been around, and now Android kicks in as well. So something is cooking. Apparently, enterprises are hiring skills that relate to mobility and browsers and API consumption, right? So if they're hiring those skills, what does that mean? And for Accenture, this is a very relevant question because we're doing that type of work for those companies. And so I'd like to give Jeff from Accelerator credit again. He published this about, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's a fantastic slide, and I just copied it. Hey. So in the past, basically, you had this 3-layer centralized web architecture, right? So you have all your data in a data mart. There's logic. That's what we do as Accenture, big iron. And finally, presentation. It's on your desktop, right? It's on your desktop. You can't move it. And CIOs love that, right? Vertical silo. It's basically, you sort of build a Yugo, and you put a rocket ship on it, right? It does one thing, and then it goes. And so what we have, the new reality here is basically you have this app-centric distributed cloud model. Everything sits in the cloud, and you connect to it through a device of your choice. Dropbox, Box.net, those guys are doing it, right? And you're almost commoditizing the OS, right? Because if you own state, it doesn't matter on what type of device you consume your data, right? So you basically, companies like Box commoditize the OS, right? It's all in the cloud. In fact, this morning, I finished up the presentation this morning. I put it up on Box, and we shared it, and boom, and here it is. I don't have a PC on me. So what does that mean? Well, in layman's terms, if I want to explain that to my mother, I tell her, Mom, it's like running a building. You used to run a building like the Eiffel Tower. You have the fundament, the data. On top of that is the logic, and then the presentation, right? Well, things are changing. It's more like running a city, and it's transforming into running a platform. So this is a fundamental shift of how we run IT as data gets more and more exposed, and you can talk and connect with any other object in the cloud here. So fast forward then, what does that mean? And we believe that apps and connected devices will fundamentally transform our lives. And if you believe you've seen a lot, we think a lot more stuff is coming. So we talked about amplification. Let's talk about task-centric instrumentation. So 2 companies I wanted to mention, IFT and Twine. I hope I pronounced it the right way. So if this, then that, right? We all, I think, who is coded? There you go, right? And so, basic if, then, what? instructions. So if you can do that, so basically they connect with, I think, 80 or 100 applications. And so you can do something like, if something happens on Gmail, you can do something on Evernote, right? So you're starting to instrument all these different apps, and they talk to each other. So Logic Beat, even though I have your tiny vertical silo with the app, they're talking to each other. Twine is a sensor. It's basically a smartphone with sensors put in a shelf, and it senses moisture, it senses temperature. So you put that into your house, and if the temperature goes above a certain degree, it sends a tweet, right? And so you connect actually IFT and Twine, and you basically have a real-time, excuse me, sensor network in your home. And just to give you an impression of what that means, so IFT went live in 2010. This is 1 year's data, and they're in private beta, and you can see, again, there's exponential growth in terms of the number of tasks that are being created. So what people are doing, they're taking the cloud, they're taking the mobile apps, they're connecting them, they're putting them to use on their own. So think about it again, people getting replaced, machines getting replaced. What does that mean for society? Well, again, we took data from the US government, the US Department of Labor, and they published data on the labor share of the US economy, meaning what share of the GDP is being produced through manual labor as opposed to intellectual labor. And so we indexed it for 2005, and you can see, obviously, you're going back in time, it's very, very labor intensive, right? So let's take Detroit. You make cars, right? It's plumbing, you need to know how to use a hammer. And we talked about the key on the device. Now you don't need to know anymore how you engineer a key, but you do need to know how you put a piece of software as a key on a device. So what we see happening here is actually that skills are shifting, and labor intensity today is at 94, and we think it's going to be much, much lower going forward, because basically what we see is software is replacing people. So there's this wave of productivity coming our way, and if you have kids, I can only recommend, tell them to get that math or engineering degree, or otherwise things can get ugly. And we're in the business of outsourcing. Let me tell you, it's coming your way. And so, having said that, I'll close. It's a lot of data, so I hope I gave you a good rundown on what we see happening. I think we're in front of another decade of massive growth. I think we're extremely privileged to be in this industry. Massive growth. I think next year will be bigger again. And with that, thank you very much. We'll put up this deck on SlideShare. And that's it. Thank you. All right. Couple of questions?
Yeah, Lars, thanks for this PowerPoint porn. We love bubbles here, but we also love numbers, because this is like, what makes bubbles come to life. So we have 2-3 questions from the audience.
I know I'm between you and the food.
Or is your mind just buzzing, or do you have like your next $1 million or $1 billion investments already lined up?
There's one in the back. Yeah. Yeah, he asked on the please, you have the mic now.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to check on the API growth thing. Any sense of like web APIs versus mobile APIs on that?
Yeah. In all honesty, I don't, but you could look at it this way, that most companies are trying to present them as mobile companies these days, right? I can talk about consumption. I would say 70% of those APIs are consumed in a mobile app, right? And the rest of that is desktop.
I'm quite interested in the bring your own device aspect of this.
Yes.
I mean, quite clearly, like, software is eating the world, in the famous phrase.
Yes.
What will bring your own device do to, the traditional sort of mobile industry?
And bring your own device from a CIO perspective, or
say in the enterprise.
Yeah, in the enterprise. So so we just completed a CIO survey here. It's one of the biggest headaches, right? I mean, it's almost like stating the obvious, right? But it is a huge headache, because you have to manage all these different devices. And that's one aspect. The other one is security, right? Security isn't the same on any device, and security on a native app is different than security on an HTML5 app. So yeah, in all honesty, I believe the answer to that is HTML5 and moving everything to the browser, right? The gap between a native and an HTML5 experience, right, is mainly defined by what needs a lot of processing power and access to certain sensors on the device, right? And then the question is, like, what are the use cases where you need exactly that in an enterprise environment? And you will find out that typically you don't need that, right? Like access to the camera, in fact, privacy and data. So, we recommend go down the browser path, right? Having said that, we're a professional services company. We do what we're asked to do. So if somebody wants a native app, we build a native app.
Last question. Sure. So thanks a lot, Lars.
All right, thank you.